All right, welcome to Apologetic Showdown. I'm here with Mr. Brass, and we're going to be talking about pro-life and pro-choice argumentation. And I know this is a controversial topic that not all viewers are going to necessarily agree with us, but we're analyzing these things from an objective standpoint, and disagreements, and of course, post questions and comments, and we'll take it from there. So yeah, thanks for coming on. So I don't know if you had a particular starting point that you wanted to start us off with. I was just going to kind of, just see where the conversation goes.
Well, as people may know or may not know, that I actually did write a book on for the pro-life side called The Abortion Saga, um, and it was a very interesting work. I had been collecting the research for it for a while now. Originally, when I started collecting the research, I wasn't even fully pro-life at all. I was just sort of going through what I could find. And, it was in the process of doing that I eventually did come to be pro-life. Uh, but very often, I always feel that the humanity of the unborn is always typically a good starting point. Because that's generally what I always find many straw men towards, and I find the most distressing sort of comments that I get.
Yeah, in terms of, you mean like disparaging the unborn's life, or?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah,
Um, Very often I see dehumanization tactics that are used, such as saying it's just a clump of cells, which, funny enough, if, all humans are biologically that, if we're just going to go completely biology-wise, that's all humans are.
right. Yeah, and of course, from my perspective, I would add in the soul as well, but I know we kind of disagree on that. But yeah, I mean, for the typical pro-choice advocate, yeah, they're going to argue that everybody's just clump of cells. I suppose they mean it more like a clump of cells without like conscious reflection. So they would say that maybe that's where the distinction comes in, but I wouldn't grant that that's an intrinsic difference. So how would you? Well, I guess we'll kind of go through the arguments. But like, how would you respond to that though? Like, if somebody says, "Well, an unborn child or unborn fetus says a clump of cells, but they lack sort of like consciousness or rationality in the
I,
fullest
al-
sense."
yeah, I always point out that consciousness is a very difficult topic if we're going into philosophy of mind. Like, generally, they just presuppose their own materialistic worldview onto it, and they never actually take the time. Like, it was interesting learning from guys like John C. Buck how we actually measure stuff like pain. We don't actually measure pain, so to say. What we do is we use surrogate methods or indirect ways of measuring pain, where we measure things that we find are correlated to pain. Like, I can't, really, to give an analogy, it's sort of like, there's two different ways I can measure a fridge. I can measure a fridge either by directly putting a ruler onto it, or let's say you send me a photo of your fridge and you tell me to say how tall it is. Well, I can use indirect methods such as the shadows and objects next to it in order to determine its height, but it's indirect. I'm not actually there with the ruler to measure it. So that's the difference between the two. And so they sort of had to presuppose their own, like a material sort of worldview to do that, which I'm not entirely opposed to if argumentation can be given for it.
So
Uh,
with that analogy though, with like the refrigerator, are you saying like because the unborn child still has pain senses that we can detect that indirectly? Is that the argument that you're making?
can make inferences about that. John C. Bach, I believe, he was on this LifeSite News podcast where he actually went over that, where we can be reasonably certain before 24 weeks that the unborn have some noticeable pain. They say, I think he says about 18 to 20 weeks that we can be sure of. He says 13 weeks, it's, up for debate on 13 weeks. But that's as low as we can get so far. But, even he admitted that a lot of our things are just surrogate measures. We don't actually measure pain per se. We measure correlates of pain.
Yeah.
There's a difference between me saying that there is an actual pain and me saying, like, if I hit you on, like, give me another analogy. It's like they have, like, when you're in pain and you go to the doctors, they give you a chart, right? They say, what's your, how much in pain are you? 1 to 10. With 1 being the least amount of pain and 10 being the most. That's what they'll generally say. The reason why is interesting. It's because they can't actually go inside your mind and say, are you in pain right now? So they have to use an indirect measure to get it.
Yeah.
We have to be able to make an inference of pain, not really going full on. But I find that, when you go into the philosophy of mind on this, you got many different perspectives. You can be a substance dualist. You can be a heliomorphic, I would say either monist or dualist. There's debates over which one heliomorphism would fall under, because it's technically 2 different substance, like it's 2 different aspects. So some people call it dualism on that, but it's just one overall thing, unified. So there's people that say it's monistic as well. So depends on where you go from on this. But there's also panpsychists who believe everything has some amount of consciousness to it. Like, my phone I'm talking off of has some degree of consciousness in it. There's like, the reason why we, when you get to a certain level of consciousness, when matter or whatever collects to it, you get to us. That's a panpsychist sort of view. Everything has degrees of consciousness. It's just we only notice it when we get to this stage that we are currently in. So there's of course eliminative materialists who believe that consciousness is an illusion, or at the very least that it's not important.
Right. Now, where would you say that you fall on that spectrum?
I definitely consider myself a materialist in the sense that I do believe that the mind, like, I believe that I'm trying to think how to word it. I do believe that the mind is the brain, like with us. Although, of course, I'm not a complete materialist in that regard, because I do believe that there are immaterial things, like God, for example. But I don't really go beyond that limit for us.
Right. So somebody in the chat asked if you're an atheist. So do you want to clarify your position on that?
When I'm in public, I just call myself an agnostic. But online, I go by I'm a deist. That's more or less fits my personality and where I stand on my beliefs. I call myself a weak deist in the sense that I don't have a high degree of certainty, but I still believe.
Yeah, I remember we had talked about that some. So somebody also brought up idealism, or excuse me, that's not the right chat.
Oh yeah, that's one. That's something that inspiring philosophy and many others like Keith Ward go for. Which they raise interesting points. I'm not entirely convinced of it, but I do think it is something that you can't just dismiss out of hand.
Yeah. I would say I lean kind of in between probably more towards the hylomorphic type perspective. Probably be the closest to my perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's very, heliomorphic dualism is very popular amongst Aristotelians and Thomists. Although Aristotelians have a very different perspective of the afterlife than Thomists do.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
Traditional Aristotelians, they hold to heliomorphism, but they believe that the mind and brain, while separate in a way, in a sense, they are needed for one another. So that was Aristotle's perspective, where he believed that while people had a soul, it needed the body to survive on.
Right. Right. And then that gets into the issue with individuation and, where Aristotle and Plato kind of differed on that. So, well, we're getting more into philosophy of mind. I want to get to some of that, but people are asking about this, so let's stick on this for a second. So somebody says, perhaps, what do you think about philosophical zombies as a defeater for physicalism?
To me, I think the whole thing of philosophical zombies, this is David Chalmers and how he put it. I honestly do think that it's sort of a non sequitur to a lot of things, because I'm trying to think of how to word this greatly, but if you had a robot, that was not conscious but could say that it was conscious, could you really tell it the difference between a robot that actually did have consciousness? Both the robots could say that they're conscious, but only one actually was conscious. It would just seem that there's an extra oomph that is given to consciousness that I don't really think is really granted. Now, I don't go as far as maybe some eliminativists and say that consciousness is just not existent. I just say it's unimportant.
Yeah. Well, I guess with the philosophical zombie argument, my understanding is you wouldn't be able to tell from just looking at like the atoms or the the molecules and such whether a being was conscious or not. So if you're going to grant that consciousness is real, then it seems like there's something extra, and then, or at least like qualia or there's something extra there to the mind beyond just like the matter that we're observing. So it would seem to go beyond, a reductionist kind of materialism, is my understanding. And it seems like I find that a convincing argument.
There is definitely other ways. I always do notice that, if you ask different philosophers what they mean by philosophical zombies, you'll get different answers, because a lot of them, they hold on to the philosophical zombie analogy, but many of them don't like how Chalmers put it. So there's like 1,000 different framings. Like, it depends on, like, even one of my friends, Johann Rotz, who's a friend of Inspiring Philosophy, even he admits that it's not really well defined in, like, the philosophy of mind of what even a philosophical zombie would look like, or how to even define it. And that just goes into a problem of consciousness with how to do it. Now, I do think that, just to get back on abortion and stuff like that, I try to make as many arguments that don't include personhood in the premises at all. Like, I remember I gave you my book. Well, you think you bought it, I believe.
No, sorry, I haven't gotten it yet, but I hope to.
But in my book, I try to give as many arguments that do not involve the notion of personhood. I do that deliberately.
Yeah, I think that issue can kind of confuse the debate a little, because it's a difficult topic to debate. So I agree that probably avoiding that issue will make the debate a little bit easier to tread.
Well, then there's plenty of good debates that one can go for it. There's many different arguments. I can't remember, his name was like Marquez or something like that. I can't remember. Where he did the future like ours argument, where even if a fetus is not currently like us, it's not a person, it still has a future like ours. And the whole point of part of why we see killing as wrong is because it deprives someone of their future that they otherwise might have had. And that applies even though a fetus may or may not be a person, he leaves that to the side. And he says that, it's no doubt that a fetus has a future like ours. If not, if no one killed or anything, it would grow and have a future like ours, and that's sort of what makes it wrong to kill it.
Yeah, I haven't heard that argument with the title, but yeah, that's the type of argument that I find to be pretty convincing. Because if we allow the fetus to grow, it's going to continue to grow, and as you said, have a future like ours. So it does seem like we are taking away its future. So I find that to be a compelling argument. I do want to pull up one from the chat. Mind Onion says, one can argue for pro-choice without denying the unborn as a human life with all the rights entailed. I usually don't see arguments against that position, and I think it's the majority pro-choice position.
There are definitely some more, I would say, educated pro-choicers who they don't deny the humanhood, although you'll see this on Fox News. You'll see this pro-choicers on different news networks that they'll all say, oh, well, it's not human. I'm like, what else can it be? It's like, I actually made a meme out of it where I took an embryo of an elephant over time, and at the very end, I just replaced it with a human. And I said, this is what pro-choicers think embryology is with humans. And it's like, well, no, it's sort of like this logic. Like, any two members of the same species, they can only produce another member of their own species. That's fairly uncontroversial. Even young Earth creationists will agree with that.
Yeah.
Two dogs mating will always create a dog. And, two elephants that mate will always create an elephant. So the same thing goes, two humans mating will always form another human. There's nothing incontroversial about that. But that is something that I often see. Now there are more, like I said, educated pro-choicers who do know the science better that will say, yeah, we grant it's human. But there are, I do speak to that audience a lot on Twitter that they don't even accept that it's a human.
Right. And it seems like the argument they'll end up making this weird kind of, well, I think it's weird, sort of subjectivism, it's not human until it leaves the womb or something. And I'm like, okay, so your location determines whether you're human or not. It's things like that end up just reducing to absurdity.
Well, yeah, that goes into the viability argument, which viability...
But some will define humanity that way. They'll say, well, it's not human until it actually leaves the womb. And it's like, well, different people can be born at different points. I was born at 7 months. It's it just becomes radically subjective. And it's think of the ways that people can use that type of argument to justify anything. Women, and if you're this race, or you're not human, it's ridiculous to follow that line of logic.
Well, yeah, it also goes into this sort of absurdity, because there are times when a woman needs surgery, I think, I can't remember what it's called, scoliosis or whatever, where a woman will need a surgery while she's pregnant, and what they'll actually have to do is remove the unborn briefly out of its location so they can do the surgery, and then they put it right back in. So by their logic, does that mean it went from human to non-human in a span of the minutes or hours of the surgery?
Right.
Well,
they have this radical, the argument kind of has this radical subjectivism, the mother determines the humanity of the unborn,
But
by like will almost.
well, yeah, and I always say, we need to take that logic to its logical extreme. Can a woman decide when the child is born that it's not human? Now,
Right.
obviously, like, if a woman, let's say we saw a woman that she committed infanticide and she threw her child into the woods to get eaten by bears, and we asked the woman, well, why do you do that? And she said, well, I said it wasn't human and it didn't have rights, so therefore it doesn't.
Right.
We wouldn't buy that as an argument. We do think that the humanhood and personhood of a person goes beyond what the woman subjectively feels.
Right. Now, one argument I wanted to get to, and some people in the chat were bringing it up, is the violinist argument. Now, I feel like this argument is one of those arguments that it's like when you hear it, it's kind of, I think it throws a lot of pro-life people for a loop, but to me, it's obviously problematic, and it, like, the more I think about it, I could spot some flaws, but I think it's kind of hard to spot some of the flaws at first. But maybe you could lay out for us what that argument is, and then kind of deconstruct it.
Well, yes, the violinist argument is all about where, let's say, you wake up in find yourself strapped back to back with a violinist, like with a tube running, like connecting you to his kidneys, and you're filtering blood to him, and you're wondering, wait, what the hell is happening here? So basically, what happens is that the Society of Music Lovers have kidnapped you and forced you to be like a donor to this violinist, and they'll say, like, the doctors there will say, well, if you just stay hooked up to the violinist for 9 months, he'll be able to just leave on his own. But if you cut him off now, he'll die. So, Thompson, I can't remember her first name, but a philosopher goes by Thompson.
Yeah, Judith Jarvis, I think.
Yeah, Judith Jarvis Thompson. She's the one that formulated this. She's actually still alive, surprisingly enough. I think she's in her 90s.
I think it's like the most cited. I've read it's the most cited philosophical paper, somewhere up there like that.
Like, at least on the abortion issue,
I've heard it's overall the most cited. And I don't know if that's true, but yeah.
I know it's definitely the most cited when it comes to this topic of abortion. I do know it's like the most cited. But many people have pointed this out, but the entire violinist argument assumes one major principle, that we are only obligated to do things that we consent to, that we formally consent to. And well, that does seem intuitive, that we consent to things that, like, we obligate ourselves to things that we consent to continuously, but that's not always the case, obviously. Like, for example, if I get drunk driving and I hit a guy with my car, while I'm drinking and driving, I would still be obligated to pay for his medical expenses at the very least, for what I did, even though I didn't consent to hitting him with my car, or nor was it my intention to hit him with my car. I'm still obligated by law to compensate him. So obviously the principle is not exact, because there's clearly exceptions. And I also say, funny enough, that one could say that this principle works too well for Judith Jarvis Thompson, because if carried out through its logical extent, it would also we'd have to abolish child support. Because think about it, if a man doesn't obligate himself to his child, and their argument goes like consent to sex isn't consent to pregnancy. Well, obviously consent to pregnancy also doesn't mean consent to taking care of a child. That's what adoption is for. So why couldn't a guy who just doesn't want to be a father, if we're not obligated to do anything outside of what we ourselves consent to, then obviously that would make child support for an unwilling father unjust.
Right. Well, I guess in fairness, I can imagine Thompson and defenders of this argument saying, well, it's about bodily autonomy. Returning to the analogy, it's like, and I think Thompson even in the analogy said, like, imagine that this violinist got drunk or passed out and then wakes up and finds herself connected to this, or no, to the woman passed out and finds herself connected to the famous violinist. And, it's like, it's the bodily autonomy. So I guess somebody would say, that would be the difference with the child support. But obviously, obligation can go further than that. I think Dave Chappelle even had a comedy routine somewhat recently where he kind of made that point.
Yeah, he did, Sticks and Stones. Well, I like to always remind people what bodily autonomy actually is, because there's a lot of misconceptions. Bodily autonomy just means that you have the right to use your bodies to just means, for just means, without interference from anybody else. For what this means basically is, for example, you're allowed to go to the store and use your body as a means of getting yourself a chocolate bar. And I would also say no one should be allowed to just tackle you and forbid you from using your body in that way. However, there are cases where, obviously we have laws, and all laws ultimately make a claim on your body. When you think about it, a law against theft is saying essentially that you're not allowed to use your body as a means of acquiring something that is not yours.
Right. Right. We make all kinds of laws that can violate somebody's body, and, directly or indirectly. So, yeah, well, I mean, just merely appealing to bodily autonomy doesn't seem like a strong enough point.
Well, to me, I think it's circular reasoning in some cases, because it goes sort of like this. My bodily autonomy in this particular action is just. And I say, well, why? And they say, because I say so. And I say, well, why do you say so? Because I believe my bodily autonomy in this action is correct, is just. So you get circular reasoning to it. They'll point out to rape as the most common example with it. And I'm like, well, that doesn't disprove what I've said, because, like I said, bodily autonomy is using your body for just means. A rapist is not using his body for just means. He's actively violating someone else's way of using their body for just means. So if a person came in and whacked the rapist over the head with a baseball bat and stopped him, that would not be violating his bodily autonomy, because he wasn't using his body for just means to begin with.
Right. Well, so I guess returning to the violinist argument, because it seems like, the argument assumes that the person didn't consent to being hooked up, but obviously, most sexual encounters, the person has consented. But then, so it seems like, the argument could be repackaged to say, well, okay, but it at least works in cases of rape, because, then, the woman hasn't consented. And one of the objections that I would make is that, well, that's a fair point, in that the violinist argument can make that distinction. But I think that the analogy itself within that argument actually kind of breaks down, because it leaves out the idea that, and I don't know how to phrase it, but if we were to make the analogy more proper, the woman would actually cause the violinist to need her. See, in this example, it's like the violinist's affliction is totally independent of the woman, but in reality, I mean, the woman, and of course the father as well, have actually forced this child into existence. And then it's like, to me, there's a kind of causal element that gets left out within that analogy. And to me, then the analogy really breaks down. Because then there is a kind of direct relationship then. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, and another thing is that the violinist in this scenario is just a random stranger. It's a person that you don't know about. It's a person, but Thompson would have to have, like, in order for people that really propose this would have to believe that we have no, like, a mother has no more right, special obligation to her own child as she does a complete stranger. Which
Right.
is absurd.
Right. It blurs that distinction about the mother-child relationship. Yeah, that's been another criticism.
Yeah, and like I always go back to the child support thing to show how funny it is actually could work against them. Where, for example, imagine, interesting, if your mind is your brain, then thought crimes are also restrictions on your bodily autonomy. Yeah, technically so. Like, ultimately, all laws of society are all telling what are good uses of your body, what are good, just means of your body. And often, a thing that I often hear from pro-choicers is that they say you want to take away a woman's choice for abortion. Well, they don't understand how laws work. No law takes away your ability to choose to do something. It just penalizes violations of it.
Right.
For example, I could make if I became president, I could make 1,000 laws on rape. I'm showing just how bad I think rape is and make 1,000 new laws. But at no point have I actually removed the rapist's ability to choose to rape someone. The only thing that I have done is made a harsher penalization for when he does choose that. So you can't really take away choice from someone. You can just penalize the choice that they make. And, people will say, oh, well, you want the woman to be arrested or something. Well, no, I don't. Now, there are some fringes I've noticed on the pro-life community that actually do want that. I don't take that position. I'd say that if anyone should be arrested, it should be the doctors and the higher-ups that should be arrested, not the mother.
Right. And now one argument that I've heard, and sometimes I've seen this like on Twitter, they'll say like, well, the fact that pro-life people don't think that the mother should be arrested shows their true colors. And it's like, I'm thinking, no, that doesn't follow at all, because like it shows, and what I mean is shows that we don't really think abortion is murder. And it's like, that doesn't follow at all, because you have to take into account how society influences people, which is one of the reasons why I think abortion should be illegal, even though people say, well, people might carry out abortion anyways. I'm thinking, yeah, but the laws teach people who don't have as developed of a conscience, especially, what's acceptable behavior towards other people. So it's like when people are told that abortion is okay, like some people will say, I've heard this argument, it's a terrible argument, but they'll say, well, it's legal, so it must be okay. And I'm thinking like, well, slavery used to be legal. So it's like you have to recognize that I think there are people who undergo an abortion and not fully understand what they're doing, but it's still objectively, a murderous action.
Well, yeah, I mean, technically I call abortion homicide because that'd be more legal terminology of it. Although, if you're a Christian or religious, you can say it's murder in the biblical sense. So, you can, because there is technically grounds for that, because in the Bible, murder just means to kill predatorily. Like to kill as a lion does a zebra. Something like that, like a predator would. So one can do that. And one also can note that another difference in the violinist argument is that you are not directly killing the person. The violinist has a condition already that you had nothing to do with, and when you unplug him, you're not like taking a chainsaw to him and cutting him up. You're just letting him die from his condition. It's the difference, I would say, between failing to be able to save someone from drowning and actively pushing someone's head under the water for them to drown.
Right.
In
Well,
both cases, there's a dead person, but the intent is different.
now there was a debate a while back, and you may have watched it between. I'm looking up right now, but Peter Kraft and David Bonin. Did you watch this debate, or David Boonin? It was about 10 years ago. Well, anyways, he argues something like David Boonin's, the pro-choice defender, and he was arguing something like the violinist argument, and somebody made the point that you made, that in most abortions, or at least in many, there's actively depriving the life, like taking a violent action, not just like allowing the person to die. But what he said is, well, yeah, his argument only worked for abortions that allow the child to die, not actively taking their life. But of course, that still seems like a murderous action.
Well, if you're putting together a situation where someone will die, then you are killing them, in my view, because, I mean, by this argument, sort of logic I have noticed is that, if a parents take their newborn child and just leave them out in the woods, well, that's okay. They're not actively killing the child. They're just letting it just sit out in the forest on its own.
Right.
Which, it's stupid, because if you are creating the circumstance by which they will die, either through neglect or through through neglect, or by it being the blood on your hands directly by like taking a chainsaw to it, yeah, you are actively killing them. That's why we notice that if you hire a hitman to kill, like if I hired a hitman to kill you, I'm not rich enough, but if I hired a hitman to kill you, I would still be charged for murder, even though it wasn't my hand that killed you. Because I created the circumstance by which your life would be taken. For the love of Christ, who is ever not held accountable on the basis of ignorance to the law? I mean, I would say insane people for the most part. Like, now, if someone is truly insane, and it's very rare for even legitimately insane people to get the insanity plea to them. But even for like the insane, if someone's shown to be truly insane and not have known the concept of laws or the concept of what's right and wrong, those people would be people that we punish so in a indirect way, where we'll send them to a facility to be taken care of.
Right.
Which some people that have been to those facilities will say is actually worse than prison. Like, there are some people that would much rather be in prison than be in those facilities.
And why is that?
Because some of them are so understaffed and so poorly funded that you're fed nothing but really scraps, and you're mistreated by the doctors that just simply don't care about you in your life. So you get mistreated. So there's many people that have lived in those facilities that say, we would have much rather been in jail. We'd have been taken care of much better in prison than we would have been in this facility.
Yeah. Right. Mind Onion asks, can someone use deadly force to separate themselves from such a situation? I'm not sure.
This goes into what I was saying. Like some people will use this argument for in cases of rape. If someone's intruding on your bodily autonomy, you're allowed to kill them in self-defense. The people that say this, they don't know what self-defense laws actually are. It would not work in a court of law, because here's the thing. You're not actually allowed to kill someone, even a violent offender. What you're allowed to do is use lethal force. That is force that might kill the person, but not necessarily. and you're only allowed to use an amount of force proportionate to what the crime is. And you would have to be able to, like, that's why even police officers, when a police officer kills a person, the police officer has to undergo a little trial of their own, where they have to prove that, for one, that there was the appropriate amount of force, two, that the aggressor was not making any attempt whatsoever to stop, and three, that they continued anyway, with their force, despite being told to stop. And even then, when all those steps are completed, you're only allowed to use force that might lead to their deaths. Like, you can shoot them in the chest, hit them with a baseball bat, whatever, and that might kill them. Or even shoot them in the head. That might kill them, but, that's what it means to use lethal force. So, and even then, if a guy legitimately breaks into your house, beats the crap out of you, but the moment he sees you have a gun in your hand, he backs away. He turned his back and says, I give, I'm done. If you were to shoot him in spite of the fact that he gave up, you would go to jail for murder.
Well, I guess, I could imagine pro-choice defenders saying, well, the child is not a conscious aggressor, the unborn is still an aggressor that doesn't stop. Now, I wouldn't, of course, characterize it that way, but I could imagine them making that kind of argument.
Well, it's not aggressing, because the entire point of, for someone to be able to violate any of your rights, it presupposes that the person was, I would say, contractualism is a way of noticing this, is where the person had to have been a moral agent capable of understanding your rights and having it. For example, if a dog humps your leg, for example, do we say that dog is violating your bodily autonomy? Well, no, because the dog isn't considered a moral agent. The dog is not capable of understanding your bodily autonomy or of able to understand obligations. So in that same way, a fetus can't, a fetus can't, doesn't have obligations to anyone because it's not capable of it. Whether or not it's conscious or not, that's, one can be conscious and not be morally obligated to people. That's the insane. We don't consider them obligated to people, but we separate them from society, even though that they have obligations technically.
Right. Well, and I would also, reiterate where, the mother and father, of course, are still causally responsible for the unborn being in the situation it's in. So, like in the example of, the dog or an aggressor, it's not like if my body, say, and obviously this is just a made up example, but say like my body shot out a tentacle at somebody and forced them to start coming towards me, it would be ridiculous to then say, oh, well, then I have the right to kill them because I have to protect myself because I couldn't help it that this tentacle came out. Well, it's like, yeah, I couldn't help it the tentacle came out, but I'm still responsible. Like, they couldn't help it that they were attached by my tentacle, is the way that I look at it. So that's where I really feel like this whole like violinist kind of argument just really is not analogous, and it kind of overlooks that subtlety.
And personally, for me, I honestly take the position that it would be unjust to kill the violinist in that circumstance as well. Now,
I agree. Right, that's what I'm arguing.
Yeah. Can we use deadly force if a person insane and thus not aware of right and wrong? Well, you can use force that might lead to their killing. That's what you can do. It would all depend on the circumstance. Like, if he's seen your gun, because this doesn't matter about their insanity or not. It matters about, a person could have an IQ of 150 and be perfectly sane, but if they're violent and you've given them the options to stop, you've given you've told them to stop and they're still carrying on, you can shoot them no matter what their level of sanity is and try to. You're only allowed to use a proportionate amount of force, which is why, if they were being consistent with the self-defense case, they would say immediately after abortion, a woman would have to go to a courtroom and establish self-defense, which police officers do, and which anybody, like, even if you shoot a guy in the head who broke into your house, you still have to go to a court and answer questions in order to establish it was self-defense.
Well, I guess people would say like Roe v. Wade already established that, but
no, not really. I mean, even with cops, like if a cop shoots like a bank robber in the head who's shooting people, he even though he shoots the guy, he still has to fill out. He has to prove that it was self-defense, which is a court process in of itself. And I don't see many pro-choicers advocating for telling, and the fetus is complying with the person. Like, the mother is saying, hey, I don't want you here. The fetus is actively trying to fulfill the woman's role of not wanting its body's resources by developing. Yeah, but I mean, it's like this. If an insane person got frightened the moment you had a gun in your hand and they wanted to leave you alone after that, then you wouldn't be allowed to shoot them because they would no longer be a threat to you and they would have given up. The same thing is like with a fetus. A fetus is actively trying to follow through with your orders. You say you don't want it to use your body's resources. It's developing so it won't need your body resources. It's making an attempt, and that's what all you need in self-defense cases is that the person is making an attempt to follow your orders to back away from you.
Point. And also mind onion, I would just reiterate, you still have to, consider so just to make sure everybody's on the same page, because I know that some people in the chat haven't read the violinist argument. So the violinist is in the analogy is meant to be like the unborn child. So like this famous, so sometimes it gets brought up like, oh, can you imagine like, the child could grow up to be a famous violinist. And then, so the violinist, it's meant to be, instead of it being an unborn child, it's meant to be that grown violinist. And then, Thompson's asking, would you have, would the woman have the right to unplug herself from this violinist? And then one of the points I've been reiterating is, well, it's just not a good analogy, because in the analogy, the woman is plugged into by the violinist's friends, but in an actual conception, it's the woman and the father who essentially plug into the child. So it's a totally different analogy. But go ahead.
Yeah. Another thing is that I also make the argument that no, you shouldn't be able to, like, it depends on the violinist and what was the violinist a helpless party in the matter? Was it just like, I like to say, was it a fan club of his, like the Society of Music Lovers were a fan club of his that forced him to plug you in because they liked your music or whatever? I say in that case, it would be unjust to unplug from the violinist because he'd be just as much of a victim as the woman.
Sorry, can you repeat that point?
If, let's say the violinist, for example, he was an innocent party, where basically there was this fan club, the Society of Music Lovers that were just completely insane, and they kidnapped him while he was like in his coma from his kidney ailment, and then he plugged that woman into the woman into that violinist because they wanted to keep him alive. He didn't consent to it. He didn't tell the people to do that. And so in that case, I would think it would be unjust for the woman to be able to unplug from the violinist because it would essentially be punishing the violinist for what the Society of Music Lovers did. It would be, I like to say, like, this is how I go with rape and stuff like that. With the cases of rape, we don't even send rapist to the death penalty. So, I mean, it would seem stupid to say, well, the rapist's life matters more than the unborn who had no choice in the matter. So, I find that it's just stupid, really, that, like, so I would say it would be unjust to punish someone for a crime that they had no intention of carrying, they had no part in, like they had no choice in. So I would say, just as it would be wrong to punish a child for its father being a rapist, it would also be wrong to punish a violinist for something his fan club did to him that he had part in.
Now, I'm curious. So, since you said you had changed or had come to embrace the pro-life position through studying it, like what do you think was maybe like the most convincing argument that you found? Or maybe we already touched on it. But
well, I believe the impairment argument, along with the future like ours argument, were sort of arguments that did it for me. And
sorry, go ahead.
The impairment argument.
Yeah, can you spell that out for us?
Well, yeah, the impairment argument is basically that it is wrong to impair a being. Now, it doesn't matter if this being is a person or not. We would say it's wrong to impair a dog by, let's say, breaking its legs. We would say it's wrong to impair a cat by, let's say, clawing at its eyes. We would all, even a jellyfish, it has no brain, we would still say it's at least wrong to cut off its legs and impair it. So the argument goes that, well, what's a greater impairment than death? Because you're taking away everything.
Right. And then I was reading this, I know this is only sort of connected, but I don't know if you saw this story about this kid who's a high school wrestler, and he won state or went to state or somebody's missing at least one of his arms because of a botched abortion. And that just demonstrates the kind of continuity. It kind of combines those arguments, or it kind of gives an example of those arguments. Like, here's somebody that I guess didn't have rights to their limbs because they were unborn, and now we see the continuity with that. Now he's missing limbs.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and what's funny is that my position that it would be wrong for the woman to unplug the violinist is actually something even pro-choice advocates actually go for, as well as Peter Singer, because he says that Peter Singer is a preference utilitarian who says that individuals are obligated to bring about the best state of affairs. And, he says that it would thus be wrong to refuse to sustain a person for 9 months if that was the only way a person could survive, even though it would be of a great inconvenience to parties involved, because the eventual healing that could be brought about would lead to a better state of affairs. Now, that's Peter Singer, who's a preference utilitarian and a pro-choicer.
But sorry, can you repeat, so was he arguing, that it would be wrong for the woman to unplug from the violinist?
Yeah.
So he rejects, so obviously Peter Singer is a pretty big on the, the pro-choice side. So, but yeah. He rejects the violinist argument. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. He rejects it on preference utilitarian grounds. Yeah.
But then how come he doesn't extend that to his other argument? I mean, because my understanding is he doesn't think even born children necessarily have the right to life for a while.
He bases that on self-awareness. Or, he'll say that even a comatose person has, basic awareness. He says that sort of stuff. even though they're not showing it, which I always say, then what's really the difference between the unborn and the comatose?
Mind Onion says, I think unprotected sex leads to conception rarely enough that one can argue that sex is not consent to pregnancy, so I don't find the objection very strong.
I always think this is stupid because you can't really consent to the effects of the causes. Like, it's sort of like saying I consent to eating 3 or 4 birthday cakes a day, but I don't consent to gaining weight. Or I always make this analogy. I consent to having my head blown off by a shotgun, but I don't consent to dying. The effect, sort of, this is a notion of cause and effect here.
Right. And I mean, the person engaging in sex knows that it's a possibility that it's going to in conception, even if it's a lesser possibility.
Well, I always make the notion of also that it is tacit consent, in my opinion.
Right.
If you engage in an institution where it has certain rules, even if your intention was not to follow the rules, you're still bound by the institution. In the institution, you tacitly consent to it. To give an example, if I go into a game of chess, I tacitly consent to the rules of chess. Even though my entire intent may be that I just want to flip the board after my 5th turn, or something like that, I still tacitly consent to the rules of chess, and I'm still wrong when I don't follow them, even though it wasn't my intent to follow them, because I was within the institution.
Another argument. Oh, sorry. There was another argument I think that you were going to mention, other than the impairment and future life arguments. Was there one you were going to get to?
Well, that and yeah, I always go up to what when I go into the violinist specifically. I also say the causality is messed up in the situations. It is basically saying that prenatal children are aggressors like how burglars are, which is absurd considering the child's presence in the womb is the result of actions parents take and are beyond the control of the child. Also, even given a trespassing charge to the unborn child, it would appear giving it capital punishment without due process would be excessive, cruel, and unjust. We don't even give that to violent burglars. And trespass in general implies volition on part of the invader, i.e. that they acted intentionally and could have avoided it, whereas the prenatal kid had no intent. At most, the kid could be said to be an innocent trespasser, and if the child aggresses on the woman, it is her and the father's fault. And thus, the analogy assumes the innocence of the mother and the aggression caused against her, as it does with the stranger with the violinist. So it is, I go as, pro-life libertarians point out, is like saying a woman has a right to an abortion is sort of like saying someone has a right to kidnap someone, put them on a plane, and throw them off without a parachute mid-flight. There seems to be no right to endanger others without their consent and then intentionally or negligently fail to protect them from harm.
So this comment kind of touches on an issue I was going to bring up, that a lot of times, and I know they're arguing the opposite point, but a lot of times it gets charged with, well, only religious people life, and it doesn't seem like you're religious in the traditional sense, and I just don't think it follows that somebody has to be religious to be pro-life.
I'm part of secular pro-life, which is founded by an atheist named Kelsey Hazard. And I mean, even if you're an atheist and you believe that this is the one life we have, that seems to be a pretty good argument in of itself why we shouldn't be taking lives. Because if you believe that there is no afterlife and this is the one life we get, that sort of gives you a good, strong reason to not want to take life.
Right.
Whether
Yeah,
it
I've
be
always thought that as well. Right. It's like from a secular standpoint, it's like if you think there is no, not to say that it would be justified under religious grounds either, but it's like, yeah, I don't see how the religious issue really factors in. It
and
seems like, yeah, it's kind of a red herring.
well, yeah, I mean, I always find it funny like this is that in my experience, pro-choicers bring up religion more often than pro-lifers are. I could make atheistic arguments against abortion, and they'll say, "Oh, well, you're just a fundamentalist Christian." I'm like, "No, I'm not.
Right.
I'm not even religious in the traditional sense."
Right.
Um, yeah, and yeah, and I would say that this is like, and I also go into the impairment. We would consider it wrong to impair a dog for just out of your convenience, right? Like if I just said, you know what, my dog is a pain to walk, so I'm just going to go in there and I'm just going to break its legs. We would consider that immoral, because there seems to be no right to impair something for out of convenience. So, what is death but the ultimate impairment? Because you're taking away not just its ability to use its limbs, like you do. Oh, Spartan Theology. What's the book called?
Yeah, and that was a little bit earlier. He was asking about what your book is called.
The Abortion Saga by Baron Bonifer Brass.
Yeah, and people could find that on your Twitter, right? And I could post a link to it as well.
Yeah, it's on my. What I generally do is, since I can't get it on Amazon currently, I'm gonna perhaps work on that in the future. But for now, what someone does is they can send me $5, and I'll send them the PDF file from their email, from my email. And that's just generally how I've been doing it so far.
Yeah.
And so I say, so I'd say just as it's wrong to impair a dog for no good reason, it should be wrong to impair a fetus for no good reason, or simply out of convenience. So think about it. This takes nothing of personhood into consideration.
Right.
And I also say, even if it isn't a person, it doesn't follow that they don't have a right to life. I mean, we have laws protecting leeches, trees, and animals from being killed in many cases. So, and none of these things are what we would call persons. So I would say that, just because something isn't a person doesn't mean instantly that you have the right to kill it. And I would say that even if it isn't a person, it could be the case that we have indirect obligations to it. For example, well, let's say a dog may not be a person. The reason why we should not allow me to impair my dog is because we know from studies that people that hurt animals are often very abusive, and that tends to be one of the stages that leads up to someone being a serial killer. So we would say, while we have no direct obligations to a dog, we do have direct obligations to people, and allowing them to kill animals, like just for no good reason whatsoever, unjustly, would be wrong. So a dog and animals could benefit from indirectly from us having obligations to each other. If you can mean.
Yeah, I can hear you. There's something else I was going to ask. Oh, what do you think about the argument? I'm not sure if I think this is the best argument or not, but I see it as some plausibility for the pro-life side. So sometimes, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like sort of a benefit of the doubt. Like if you saw something that might be alive, you should give it the benefit of the doubt that it's, alive. So you wouldn't just like shoot at it or something.
Oh yeah, this is the person in the woods argument.
Right.
Like, if I believe that there was if I was going hunting and I believed like there was a 50% chance that this thing that looks like a bear might actually be a person, I wouldn't take the shot.
Right.
Because the very notion that it might be a possibility that there's a person there, or there might be a moral agent there, would lead me to just stop. I even go as far, even if I knew that there was only a 1% chance, I would still not take the shot.
Right.
Because that would be just because even if it isn't a person, I'm not taking the shot. I'm not risking it. I'll play it safe. So one could say that with the fetus is that, where even if it's not a person, we should, even though it might be debatable whether or not it's a person, we should err on the side of, we should do risk assessment and say, but let's just treat it as if it is a person. Even though we can't be sure that that's what their argument would be.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like it's a reasonable, argument. I think something one I usually go for, but yeah, I think it's a reasonable argument. I'm pretty much out of topics on that. But was there any other arguments or points that you wanted to emphasize?
Well, I recommend anyone that wants to engage with some of the literature of pro-lifers. I recommend, for one, where I get my impairment argument from. It's a paper by Perry Hendricks. Even if the fetus is not a person, abortion is immoral. The impairment argument. This is a good paper. I would recommend people. Obviously, there's my book where I list that along with, I would probably say at least dozens of others. And another one is that the entire attachment also doesn't work, because they'll say that there are a woman's attached to the fetus. That's where the bodily autonomy goes. But we'd say, there's a paper by philosopher Dr. Kenneth Einar Hema called Thompson's Violinist and Conjoined Twins. You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, where basically he says that, obviously that a conjoined twins named Joe and Tom, Joe wouldn't be allowed to just saw off his brother and kill him, just because, that it would be more convenient for him, or that, knowing that only he could survive the operation. So we would say that there is some, just merely being conjoined doesn't really work for them.
Right. Yeah, I see that. Where's that point? Oh, would you be interested? I don't have anybody lined up or anything, but would you be interested in debating somebody on this topic?
I mean, I could some other time. I'm eating right now.
Oh yeah, I didn't mean right now. I meant in the future.
Yeah, maybe in the future. I'd have to study a bit more, but I could.
Yeah. Oh well, I'm sure you know more than most people are going to be debating, but yeah, I'm trying to host more debates on this channel. I've done a couple, but I was just wondering.
Debate channels are pretty popular.
Yeah, well, my debates that I've hosted have gotten more views than other discussions. Most of the time I'm hosting discussions on this channel, but people tend to tune in more for debates. But yeah, one other point I want to bring up, and you may disagree with me on this point, but I think sometimes people forget that some contraceptives can act as abortion as well, not just Plan B, but any chemical contraception can prevent implantation. And what some medical practitioners have done, as far as I've read, is just redefine conception as implantation when conception was traditionally defined as fertilization. And to me, that's, a huge injustice. And a lot of people don't even know that.
Well, I mean, even with Plan B, I believe they even notice that they call themselves abortifacts.
Right. But I've read that yeah, and it's not just like Plan B. A lot of people know that that's considered an abortifacient, but I've read like any chemical contraception could work that way in preventing implantation if it seals off the womb even after conception. But it's one of my objections against contraception. But yeah, go
um,
ahead.
Another thing I always like to bring, like that bring up a lot, is that if abortion was made illegal, millions of like hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of women would die. I'm like, no. For one, I always like to tell them that they have a very low view of women on that sort of perspective because they believe that women would be so reckless that they would go to that length to prevent a pregnancy, for one, rather than just carry through it. Um, and two, I mean, personally, what I say as well is like this is really controversial. Is where I personally put a woman that that knowingly she's so desperate to kill her child that she's willing to put herself in potential danger to do it. I personally put a woman like that on the same moral category as a terrorist.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
but do we really mourn when a terrorist who goes into a building with, and goes in there trying to shoot up as many people as they possibly can to further their political agenda? Do we really mourn them when they get shot, even though that they knew going in that there was a chance that they might get shot at? We don't really like. I would say I would feel bad for the family, of course, like even the terrorist's family, because they probably maybe not even known about it. I feel sorry for them and the parents of the woman and her immediate family, but I wouldn't feel particularly bad for the woman in that circumstance.
Yeah. Well, I would. I would still have sympathy for anybody who's lost their life or is put in harm. But I hear what you're saying that that I hear the point that you're making that a woman would still take into consideration all the factors and such. I don't know if I would argue the point that you're arguing, but I hear what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So Mind Onion came back with they wouldn't have had independent bodily autonomy at any point if they were conjoined from birth. So I guess that was about the conjoined twins.
Well, here's the thing about that. It still should say, in the paper I referenced about that, they actually said it doesn't seem to be that there'd be much of a difference if they became conjoined 1 minute after, like, the other, right? Let's say for a brief span of 1 minute, they were, like, in the womb. Like, they weren't connected, but then they became connected the minute after. It would still seem, so it would say that they both had an independent existence for a span of 1 minute. But it would still seem like in that case that a woman, like with the case of the conjoined twins, that it would still say that the twin couldn't just kill his brother in order to, because his brother was being an inconvenience to him and was tying him down.
Right. Right. It seems like, and I mean, maybe this isn't, maybe I don't want to bring that point up, but it seems like they would have had autonomy at some point because there would have been some conjunction. Now, maybe, like, I don't know how it works. Maybe the fertilized egg just never quite separated, and that's why they're conjoined. But yeah, I don't see, there still is, like, as you said, even in the case where you use the example, they became conjoined later, then it doesn't seem like that the conjoining part is what all of a sudden makes the moral difference. Like now, somebody can then, sever the other person in a violent way. So, but yeah, I didn't have any other points though. We're over an hour now, so probably want to keep it a little bit shorter so people don't have too much to digest. But did you have any closing remarks that you want to make?
Not many. I would say that, I'd recommend going on my channel, Mr. Brass. You could check out my series on. You can check out my response to Armored Skeptic, who did a video on abortion. You can check that out, and you can just subscribe and whatever. You can help me, support me by buying my book, The Abortion Saga. Yeah, and that would be good. And check me out on my Twitter. I go by Brass Wisdom on there. Yeah, and just stop by and say hello. This was very fun. I'm glad I got to talk to you, man.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for coming on. I hope to have you back on again sometime. And then, yeah, maybe at some point we can set up for you to debate somebody maybe in the future. But yeah, anybody else watching, please click like and subscribe. And thanks for joining us.